for freedom. You're listening to Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report. Our website is democracynow.org. Teach-ins continue around the country. This past week at New York University, David Palumbo-Liu joined a number of people talking about the issue of who's next, North Korea and beyond. He was speaking at NYU Law School. He is a professor of comparative literature and director of the program in modern thought and literature at Stanford University, taking on the issue of preemption and the future of Asia-Pacific America. This is Professor David Palumbo-Liu.
The events of September 11th provided a near-perfect pretext for a war on Iraq. What were its specific effects, and what is the connection between these effects and the Middle East? The effects of 9/11 for Asia included the re-territorialization of Asia-Pacific as a region, the remapping of Asia-Pacific as a correlate territory for global terrorism occurred immediately. Republican Congressman Sam Brownback of Kansas announced, quote, "It appears the Philippines is going to be the next target after Afghanistan in the war on terrorism." The U.S. created a second front by sending 1,200 troops to the Philippines in January 2002. This redefinition of the region prompted new relations between Asia-Pacific countries and the U.S., amongst themselves and within their own national borders. Several key Asian countries renegotiated for increased U.S. and foreign aid, both to fight terrorism but also to prop up national and regional economies and political power bases, giving rise to a set of potentially contradictory demands serving various national, international, and regional interests. The Jakarta Post celebrated, saying, "Thanks to the war against terrorism, ASEAN, which lost its fire and fame due to the '97 economic crisis, has regained not only confidence but respect." So there's this kind of reconsolidating effect of terrorism on the region. In November 2002, at least 19 countries took part in an anti-terrorism conference in Manila that was co-hosted by the World Tourism Organization. The conference was called International Conference on Terrorism and Tourist Recovery. The participants included all 10 ASEAN countries plus the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, China, and the United Kingdom. So again, this widening web of new renegotiated relationships. Not only were regional relations revised, but international ones as well. For example, in November 2002, the European Commission said that Europe would help the Philippines boost its capabilities to fight terrorism through technical and funding assistance, and renegotiate a formal dispute over high European tariffs in the Asia-Pacific. It also offered European support for development aid to the Muslim-held southern Philippines region. In December, China's Public Security Minister, Jia Junhuang, struck an agreement with Philippines Interior and Local Government Secretary Jose Lina Jr. for closer cooperation between their respective police forces. As far as Asia-Pacific is concerned, beyond the new configurations of regional and national spaces, what's going on specifically with regard to U.S. strategic interests? Why all the attention to the Asia-Pacific? And why was the U.S. so interested in the opening that Arroyo provided? We have to look back to the 90s, and I'll ask you to remember that this is when Wolfowitz's defense planning guidance was leaked to the press, and the United States' global preemptive hegemonic intentions were made clear. In 1991, Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, author of the book The Asia That Can Say No, proposed establishment of an East Asia Economic Group excluding the United States and to be led by Japan. The specter of increased Japanese influence in the region, along with the expulsion of U.S. military bases from the Philippines, caused the U.S. to place increased pressure on Guam, Micronesia, and other islands to serve its strategic purposes. But what were these strategic purposes? According to the 1997 report on the Quadrennial Defense Review by the U.S. Department of Defense, U.S. national defense and security policy, implemented by 100,000 U.S. troops deployed in the region, is intertwined with economic globalization, which requires, quote, the protection of the sea lanes of trade and ensuring unhampered access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. The Pacific was considered to contain, quote, the highways of trade which are vital to U.S. security. All this is drawn together in a RAND study conducted by the U.S. Air Force and completed in the fall of 2000. The study, entitled The U.S. and Asia Toward a New U.S. Strategy and Force Posture, was written by a group whose lead author is a critical figure in both our policies in the Asia-Pacific and the Middle East, Zalmay Khalilzad. Khalilzad is a member of the Defense Policy Board. He is author as well as From Containment to Global Leadership and Bush's advisor on Afghanistan. He was instrumental in a series of conferences that produced an interim post-Taliban government in Afghanistan, and he has been named the U.S. envoy who will meet with Iraqi opposition leaders to form a government that will take power following the interim period of U.S. administration. The RAND study defines the strategic importance of Asia-Pacific in clear terms, and it's too bad that our map doesn't extend a little bit further west. The RAND study notes, quote, Southeast Asia lies at the intersection of two of the world's most heavily traveled sea lines of communication, or SLOCs. The east-west route connects the Indian and Pacific Oceans, while the north-south route links Australia and New Zealand in Northeast Asia. Nearly half the world's merchant fleet capacity sails through the SLOCs of the South China Sea and the waters surrounding Indonesia. These SLOCs serve as economic lifelines by which the economies of Northeast Asia receive oil and other critical imports and export finished goods to the rest of the world. Now, most germane for today's teach-in, the study goes on to note, from a military perspective, these sea lanes are critical to the movement of U.S. forces from the Pacific into the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. For example, during the Iran-Iraq War, 75% of U.S. ships deployed to the Indian Ocean and the Gulf were 7th Fleet ships operating out of Subic Bay in the Philippines. During the first Gulf War, the base was a critical point for refueling and reprovisioning for the U.S. Navy. Now, this is crucial. The RAND study forwards a set of strategic possibilities for the region, and it goes from sort of one extreme to the other, but this is what it begins with. At one end of the spectrum would be a strategy built on ensuring and strengthening U.S. hegemony in Asia. The key to the strategy would lie in maintaining and increasing the U.S. position of preeminent power in the region. If necessary, taking steps to constrain the economic and military growth of any other country that could threaten that preeminence, and this is what Jonathan Schell was talking about. It goes on, such a strategy would require maximum vigilance as well as the expenditure of money and effort, and as such, would probably prove incompatible with U.S. domestic requirements. Okay, so this is something they'd like to do, but it might be too costly politically. And then it lists a set of more moderate proposals ranging from forming a condominium with one of Asia's major powers to adopting a role of balancer among the major regional powers, the creation of a collective security system, and last, God forbid, disengagement from Asia. But note how 9/11 changed everything, and the Iraq War's success may encourage Washington to be more inclined to the other end of the spectrum. And note how this proposal follows closely the logic and goals of the defense planning guidance of that period, and how these themes were picked up and underscored a decade later in Bush's national security strategy and manifested in the Iraq War. Now let me just take a couple of minutes to talk about the volatility of preemption in this strategic environment. The notion of preemptive action in the Pacific is not new. In the early 1980s, the United States, preparing to fight a Soviet fleet, strategized an air naval attack on Vladivostok. It accepted the option of a limited nuclear war and a first strike option. Navy Secretary John Lehman said in June '84, quote, "Who gets to shoot first will have more to do with who wins than any other factor." Near the end of the Cold War, there was the suggestion that the U.S. reorient itself from deterring a vanishing Soviet threat to containing terrorist threats emanating from the Third World. This idea can be found, for example, in a 1988 document, Discriminate Deterrence, produced by the Presidential Commission on Long-Term Integrated Strategy. At that time as well, General Dynamics singled out India as one of the key targets for a next generation of cruise missiles. A 52-page briefing paper outlined a scenario for the year 2000 in which India and Pakistan are spoiling over a war for Kashmir. The U.S. would intervene to prevent an Indian nuclear strike against Pakistan and use 307 cruise missiles to neutralize targets in India. This is an internal document that General Dynamics invented. Today, the logic of preemption has been taken up in the Asia-Pacific. A few months ago, Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard, issued a statement in which he said, "It stands to reason that if you believe that somebody's going to launch an attack on your country, either of a conventional kind or a terrorist kind, and you had the capacity to stop it, and there was no alternative other than to use that capacity, then of course you would use it." In response, a spokesman for Indonesia's foreign ministry told ABC Radio that Australia did not have the right to launch military strikes in other countries and warned that countries could not flout international law and norms willy-nilly. The Thai government said no country should do anything like Howard suggested. Each country has its own sovereignty and must be protected. And Philippines' national security advisor said, "It's a very surprising statement, to say the least, in fact bordering on shocking. I can't believe that it would come from a supposedly friendly country in the neighborhood. You were talking about a region with a very strong government. This is the 21st century, not the 19th century." And Arroyo, when asked about Howard's comments, said, very Bush-like again, "Oh, I don't listen to what other people say." I mean, it was very unconscious, but very true. And then she followed up by saying, "Well, we all know that the yen is mightier than the sword." So it sort of shows ways of dealing with things like this. What we have then is a powerful combination of three things: unilateralism, preemption, and hegemonic initiatives, all with anti-terrorism as a spark. In sum, the future of Asia-Pacific is intimately tied to the future of the Middle East, both because of its strategic importance via the South China Sea, but also because of the ideological after-effects of 9/11 and the Iraq War, on renegotiating, reshaping national, regional, and international policies. Finally, let me say a few things about Asian America. First, the interstitial space between the U.S. and Asia-Pacific has been deeply affected in the radical redefinition of relations. I'm speaking of immigrant and diasporic subjects. Renegotiations of regional and international relations provided the occasion for revisiting new anti-terrorist policies in Europe and the U.S. that adversely affected Filipinos, for example. In the Anti-Terrorism Pro-Tourism Conference, Arroyo asked Francis Taylor, U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines, for exemptions for Filipino-American security workers who would lose their jobs because of their lack of citizenship, and Colin Powell was also pressed on Asian American issues upon his announcement of the signing of the Mutual Logistics Support Agreement. He was tested on the question of U.S. deportation of overseas Filipino workers, as well as the loss of jobs faced by them. And the Philippines Foreign Undersecretary Delia Albert asked the European Union to remove the Philippines from a list of countries whose citizens have to undergo special screening before they're granted entry visas. So in the trafficking between the regions, there are very important negotiations based on this opportunity. Closer to home, let me just mention 5 things. I'll just do it as a list. First, the real sense of increased militarization. When Turkey refused our troops that space, it set the U.S. government on a rampage to build up more bases around the world, so that little wrinkle could never be significant again. The significance of such a siphoning of economic and political resource capital into such an enterprise, and the draining of them from social welfare to other types of domestic issues. Things that the RAND report worried about, but now I think those kinds of concerns are less striking. The racial composition of the U.S. all-volunteer army. I think that when we talk about an all-volunteer army, we have to understand the conditions in which this volunteerism takes place and the very uneven effects it has on different racial groups. 4, the possible resurgence of xenophobia and attacks on unpatriotic Americans, those who would be dissent. And 5, the heightened surveillance on immigrant groups and dissidents, wiretapping of trans-Pacific communications, especially at the university. Jack mentioned how precious our universities are, and yet, that under the Patriot Act, all of your transcripts are open for access, lest you be building a nuclear weapon. But anything that you have at the university is now available to the U.S. government, plus the visa hassles for international students, etc. Overall, and in conclusion, note how the logic of preemption hijacks the future. I think this is a really important thing for us to think about. Our imagination is now pegged to a specific, pragmatic purpose of imagining who threatens us, who might threaten us, and how to neutralize that threat. How to neutralize it seems to require much less imagination than the others. But the whole issue of preemption masks the real issue for me. And that is one of global dominance and strategic applications of preemption. We don't want to preempt everybody, but there are certain sites that we want to involve ourselves in. Obviously and critically, you cannot engage the logic of preemption without hegemony. But the whole notion of hegemony is now, this wonderful phrase, benevolent hegemony, that was articulated by Crystal and Kagan in '96 when they proposed a neo-Reaganite foreign strategy. That was, if you read that '96 document, you get the flavor of a lot of what's happening now. Finally, as a literary critic, you wonder what a comp lit professor is doing up here. I'm very interested in the power of rhetoric. I'm especially interested in the immense power of storytelling. How do we buy certain stories as realistic and having a purchase on our imagination? Against the narrative and political plots of preemption, we need to forward critical counter-narratives, counter-imaginings, and for that we need information, knowledge, multiple perspectives, and hence my delight at being here and my anticipation of our question and answer. Thank you.